Hi, welcome to the lecture on the British colonial system. As you see on this map, the world by 1700 was beginning to be carved up into colonial systems. Now, this is a system of colonies which were meant to send resources back to the mother country and provide markets for the mother country that they produced. Now, oftentimes when we're talking about American history, we tend to focus on what becomes the United States as the center of that British colonial system. And that's not really true. The colonies in North America were important, but if we were going to look for the most important place in the British Empire, we might be better to look at India. India really is the crown jewel, as was said, of the British Empire and provided the wealth of that empire. The American colonies are important. They were a destination for excess population. They did buy some of those finished goods. They did provide raw materials, tobacco, and other things for England. But it really was the British East India Company and their growing empire in India that was the heart and the lifeblood of that British Empire. The East India Company can be better thought of as a corporation with an army. It didn't so much conquer India as arrive in India at a time when the empire, the Mughal Empire in India, was in a sort of decline, which allowed the East India Company that showed up with the wealth of Europe, the gold and silver that was flowing out of America, sloshing around the world, destabilizing the world's economic system, causing inflation everywhere it went. When the British showed up there, or more correctly, the English showed up there, they arrived at a time when, because of those factors, the Mughal Empire was in decline. And so some of the various local rulers who originally owed their loyalty to the Mughal Empire began shifting towards the British East India Company because there was an economic opportunity there. Eventually, that became a sort of dominance, which eventually became the British colonial experience in India. But that is where the wealth came from for really the next couple hundred years. Up until 1945, the decisions that the English and later British made about world affairs often revolved around how it would affect India. Would losing access to Persia upset their ability to send ships to India or overland transport to India, anything like that, telegraph lines as we move into the future. So all their decisions were driven by how that might affect the British East India Company and the wealth that was pouring out of India. And that's important later in our story, because what comes out of India? Well, as a result of that trade, tea began to flow back to England. And ultimately, that's going to be one of the factors that leads to the American Revolution here in about 70 years or so. So this is a period of mercantilism. That's what we call the economic system during this period, up through kind of 1776, when Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations. So what is mercantilism? It's often described as a sort of, just a focus on gold. Gold is a factor in there, but really, at its heart, it's about trade. The best way to think of mercantilism is a highly regulated trade system. It's a system which ensures that, we're in competition with other colonial systems. Think of the English colonial system, the French colonial system, the Spanish colonial system. Each one of those systems is in competition with the others for access to world trade. And one of the problems is, to access that, you are going to need wealth, gold, all of those things. And so the idea is that with mercantilist systems, we need to prevent our people. So let's say we're the British. We want to keep our British citizens from purchasing things from another country because that other country is potentially an enemy. And if our citizens, for instance, buy a hat from France, what happens in that transaction? Well, our citizen gets a hat, but what flows to France? Gold. And that gold will then decrease the amount of gold that England has and increase the amount of gold that France has. Now, that's a very simplistic sort of transaction there, but that's what the fear is that the gold will flow to a potential enemy, thereby strengthening them in this colonial competition. So it's a highly regulated trade system. What can we do to prevent our citizens from buying those French hats? Well, we could put on trade regulations that prevent them from importing, or taxes that make it less likely that they'll import that hat. Or we can control the ships that stuff can be imported on. There's a whole host of regulations that can limit our citizens' access to that trade, thereby hoping to keep the gold within our system. On the other hand, we don't mind exporting things to other countries because what does that do? It brings in gold into our system. So this is a competition for world trade, and it's how do we limit that? And so if you're going to compare it to the system we largely have today, even with discussions of tariffs in the news every day, the system we have today is largely a free trade system. You don't really think about where products come from. You pay some tariffs, but they're so hidden within the cost of the items that they really don't affect your decisions very much. And very often, in order to keep the price in the United States low, countries overseas will eat that tariff in order to ensure that you will still buy their product. So we don't really think about tariffs on a daily basis, and they don't tend to affect us that much, although we do face them. So you can buy anything from any place, and you don't really worry too much about tariffs. And so that's a relatively free market trading system. So it's very different to the system that was in dominance during the 1700s. So as an example of the types of things that would be passed in the case of the English, beginning with Charles II, after the Restoration during the 1660s, Charles II and Parliament began to enact a series of navigation acts. Now, you don't need to know all these acts. There's a whole lot of them. But we just kind of lump all of these regulations under the navigation acts. And they do things like limit what types of ships goods can be transported on, where you can sell things. They're going to create a enumerated list. Well, what's that? It's a fancy name for a list of articles that either are banned from selling to our potential rivals or must go to England first before they can be sold on to someplace else. Now, why would we do that? Remember, we're in competition. We don't want our enemies to get some product that might enhance their power. And also, if it goes to England first, we can ensure that any tariffs or anything, those regulations are followed in the transport over to France or wherever it's going. So all of these regulations pile up over a series of years. People don't like them, but they're pretty easy to avoid. And so it doesn't cause a revolution when the Americans begin to feel some of the effects of these. And the bottom line is they like trading with England, so it's really not that big a problem. They'll buy stuff from the French, the Spanish, the Dutch when it is a better price, but their dominant trade is going to be with England anyway. And it's easy to avoid if you want to smuggle. Everybody in this period gets good at smuggling. because nobody wants to pay those taxes. So when a ship leaves port, how do you know where it ends up? Does it take a detour to a French or a Spanish or Dutch territory? Well, you can easily avoid that problem. And so that's it's something that's going to keep this from really being the friction that later on it will be. The problem is going to be that the British are going to get involved in a series of wars that we're going to talk about here. And wars cost money. And as the costs of those wars pile up, Britain has to collect more and more. And so in order to collect more and more, what do they have to do? Tighten the regulations, ensure that the smugglers are prevented, ensure that the taxes are collected. It's that process over the course of roughly 70 years or so that builds up the frictions to the point that ultimately will end up in the revolution in the 1770s. So on the screen here, I have a series of those trade regulations. So you can see we got Navigation Acts. What are we doing? We're doing minimal things, trying to keep the Dutch out of our trading business. Then we're going to have restrictions on where you can buy your molasses. Why is molasses important? Because it's used for making rum, which New England excels in making rum. Do they care where the molasses comes from? No, they really want the cheapest molasses that they can get to produce a good product. And so it's going to create a little bit of friction. Then you see additional ones where we're closing the loopholes. Well, if you're closing the loopholes, what does that imply? It implies that people are getting around the spirit, at least, of these various regulations. And then you see down here the Woolens Act. What's that about? Well, remember, what is the role of the colony in that colonial system? In an ideal situation, the colony should produce raw materials that are shipped to the mother country. The mother country turns those into finished goods and sells them back to the colony. Well, if the colonies are producing woolen goods, what's the problem? You have created competition for yourself. And so they begin to limit that ability for the colonies to export their woolen goods because it would be in competition with the British industries. And then you see the Hat Act and so on. And so all of these things are meant to tighten up the regulations over the period of years, and eventually those frictions are going to be among the reasons that we end up in the American Revolution. But regardless, even with all those regulations, trade is booming between the colonies and England. Wealth is being exported and imported back and forth. Everybody's happy. And as long as everybody's happy, everybody's going to kind of look the other way on some of these things. The other thing that we want to kind of understand, though, is a difference between the North and the South at this time. The North, remember, has built a society where it is manufacturing things like rum, woolen goods, hats, all of that stuff. And as a result of that, they have a very complex economy. And increasingly, they derive their own banking system from that wealth. If you want to expand your business, you're not going to go to London to get a loan in order to do that. You're going to find local sources in order to expand your business, whatever the case may be. And so finance becomes another part of the industry or economics of the northern colonies. Think of Wall Street, right? We think of it today as a financial heart. Well, it really began back during this period, going back as far as the Dutch, that idea of financing things here rather than going back to the mother country. In the South, though, how does their economy work? It's a cash crop society. What do you need for cash crop society? You need land, labor, and you export the cash crop. And so how did that economy work? The grower of the tobacco, in the case of Virginia, doesn't sail off to London to sell his tobacco. The tobacco has to be exported. You're not going to make your money here in America. So he doesn't sail off. He sends it off to England to a factor. Today we would call it an agent. You have an agent in London, and that person's going to be responsible for selling your production for that year. And you are then going to ask that agent in turn to buy you the things you want. So you're going to get your stuff from England, and the factor is both going to sell your crops and buy the stuff and ship it back to you. Now, he's not doing it because he's a good friend. It's a business, and he's going to take a percentage. And very often, those transactions allow him to ensure that you're constantly in debt. And you always want more than you can buy, and he's going to offer you those loans or whatever. And so the wealthy planters in the South, and this is true all the way up to the Civil War, the wealthy planters, by and large, are very wealthy. They have very nice stuff, but they have very little cash in their pockets. And they are in debt to agents in London. And so their finances are extended through London, whereas in the North, it's not. And so that's going to be a difference. It's going to continue to grow as we go through the semester here. So this period, as I said, is a period of wars of empire. All of those colonial systems, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, are in competition with each other and seeking access to both colonies and trade routes. And what is that going to lead to? A series of constant wars. Now, they've been at war on and off really this entire semester, but this period is going to be particularly intense. And so the memory device for this period is AG4, Anne and the four Georges, Queen Anne, and then four King Georges. For us, the most important one is going to be King George III because he's king during the American Revolution. But the question hanging over the world, really, for this period is who rules the world. These wars are being fought to see who's going to become the dominant trading and power in the world. Ultimately, that is going to be the British, right? They're going to come out of this thing as the world's most powerful empire. But it's going to be a series of wars to get us there. For the colonies, the importance of this period is that at the beginning, they view themselves as all separate entities. You would view yourself more as a Massachusetts Englishman than you would a Massachusetts American. And you would see yourself as a Virginia Englishman, less than a Virginia American. There is no unified sense among these colonies, although they all derive from originally the British or the Dutch in the case of New York and New Jersey. This series of wars, though, is going to force them to increasingly work together to defend against French and Indian attacks from the north and Spanish from the south. And they're going to have to start to think of themselves as having common interests. And so the importance for our story is that narrative there. The colonies shift over the course of these wars to seeing themselves as Americans. And so by the end, as we approach the American Revolution, you might more see yourself as having more in common with the neighboring colonies than you would with England first. So we'll talk about these wars briefly. We're not going to spend a lot of time. This isn't a history of war class. But the first one we're going to talk about is King William's War, which takes place in the late 1700s. Remember, you have King William and Mary, the Queen, and they really begin this process. And the wars that we're going to talk about here all are about European things. These are wars that start elsewhere in the world, mostly in Europe, and they are about European things. The reasons they affect the colonies is because you have France to the north and you have Spain to the south. And as a result of that, the wars of Europe are going to bleed over here to the colonies. In the case of the northern colonies here, it's going to be a continual war against French and their Indian allies, raiding in from the north and then scheming to get them out of that northern region. The other problem is the French tend to be Catholic. Most of the English are Protestants. And so we have that religious component as well as this national component that's driving these wars. In the case of King William's War, there's going to be raids down into Massachusetts and that region, very devastating, loss of life there. The colonists are going to get together and, along with the British Navy, attempt a raid into what's now Canada. And eventually the war peters out with the Treaty of Ryswick. Now, it ends with status quo ante bellum. And that's an important Latin term to know for this course. Status quo ante bellum. Status quo, we know, status unchanged. Antebellum, before the war. So in other words, the status is unchanged from before the war. We had a war, we're going to pretend it's never happened, and we're just going to continue on. So if I captured a fort in the war and you captured an island, at the end of the war, we might just give those back to each other and we're going to continue on. Now, if you end a war with status quo ante bellum, what's the likely result? You haven't resolved the problems that led to the war, and so you're likely to get another war. And that's what's going to happen here. Remember, in the case of Europe, they're thinking of war about gaining advantage over the other person or the other empire, but they don't see it as the way we would see it in terms of a national identity. I'm losing my right arm or something. These are things where they exchange back and forth, and we didn't win this war, well, we'll win the next war. And so because it ended with status quo ante bellum, that meant the issues were not resolved, which means there'll be another war. And in our case, Queen Anne's War. And so we'll start that AG4 period here. As you can see, this is a relatively long war. It doesn't mean constant fighting throughout that period of time. And once again, it's about European things. This is the War of Spanish Succession. In the colonies, the wars are always referred to as the ruler in England at the time, so Queen Anne's War. But everybody else in the world would know it as the War of Spanish Succession. Again, that has nothing to do with the colonies. But because we have the French to the north, Spanish to the south, it means that war is going to bleed over here. And so there are attacks into the southern colonies. The French are going to raid again into New England. So Georgia, Massachusetts are both going to be attacked during this thing. During the course of this war, Acadia is going to become Nova Scotia. So that's one piece of land that's going to change as a result of that, which means some French people will end up under English rule. It also, though, just peters out. And so the Treaty of Utrecht is going to settle this, and once again as status quo ante bellum. Now, Nova Scotia is going to stay with the British, but other exchanges are made, and essentially it is an unchanged situation from before the war. Now, all these wars cost a lot of money. And so, as I said with the Navigation Acts, they got to think about how do we get more money to pay for all these wars. And so one thing they do is pass the Molasses Act in 1733. So why is molasses important? That's the basis for rum. And New England is a big rum producer, so they need to import molasses because it doesn't grow up there. Now, do they care where it comes from? If it comes from the Dutch West Indies, the Spanish, the French, no. They want the cheapest molasses, but because Britain needs to make sure that they're collecting money, they're going to put a tax on imported molasses in order to try to stop that importation. Now, that is not going to be a big problem. But again, it's part of this friction that's developing between the colonies. It's still easy to smuggle this in, and so we can do it. We can either bribe the collector, we can sneak it in at night, whatever the case may be, to avoid having to pay that tax. And so Britain is placing it on there in order to try to tighten up regulations within the empire, but people can still get around it. Now, the next war we'll talk about is King George's War. And so 1744, this war kicks off. Again, it is not about American things. It's about European issues. In this case, the War of Austrian Succession. We don't care about it for our case. It grew out of a series of wars. There's other wars that go on during this period of time we're not going to spend any time on, such as the War of Jenkins' Ear, my favorite named war there is. In this case, a British ship had stopped a Spanish ship as part of the regulations that were set in place from a previous war. They had the right to search foreign trade ships. They went in, searched the ship. A Spaniard got a little upset, sliced the ear off of a Mr. Jenkins, and that led to a renewed fighting. Eventually, it bleeds into this King George's War. And once again, the colonists are going to become involved because of France to the north, Spain to the south. Now, in the case of this war, the colonies are going to have to work together much more because the British are heavily involved around the world. They can't provide as many troops or as much navy to help them out during the course of this war. Also, American regiment is going to be created and actually be an expeditionary force going down to Colombia and elsewhere fighting. But in the case of New England, Massachusetts is going to drive a push to take care of that French problem once and for all. Remember, they have continually raided down into those colonies, and it was very often a slaughter. And so there's anger over religion, there's anger over the way the French and their Indian allies had behaved in war, and they want to settle this thing once and for all. And so Massachusetts rallies some of the other colonies to put together a force to go invade into what's now Canada. And so the big fort was Louisbourg, which controls access to the St. Lawrence Seaway. So if you control that fort, you control really Canada. And so the plan was to go up, take that fort, and along with some British Navy who helped them do this, they invade and they take that fort. In their minds, this was a God-given victory. They had defeated their hated enemy, the French, and not just the French Catholics. And it was seen in that light. It was a great victory. But the war ends, and it ends as status quo ante bellum. And so, once again, land is exchanged. And one of those pieces is Fort Louisbourg. This causes a lot of anger because the colonists do not see things the same as the British and the French see them. To them, this has an emotional component to it. And they don't accept that this should just be given up for some Dutch island in the West Indies. And so it's going to lead to this friction heightening as we come out of this war in 1748. The next war that we're going to talk about, though, and we'll talk about this in class, is about American things. It starts here. It starts about American things. It becomes a world war. And that war is the French and Indian War. Now, by this point, the mid-1700s, the colonists are fairly well settled along the coast there. Now, there are other things going on in the North American continent at that time, right? There are the Spanish out in the west. We don't spend a lot of time on them because they don't become important to the main story for at least another 50 or so years. But, for instance, the city of Santa Fe traces its roots back to the 1600s. Same thing with Goliad and San Antonio here in Texas to the early 1700s. And so there is stuff going on here, but we'll come back to that story later in the semester and catch up with what has been happening as the Americans begin to move out into this region. So by this point, by the mid-1700s, the American colonists on the East Coast have a well-developed society, functioning economies, tightly connected with the mother country, but we have these increasing frictions. And that's really the story of the next war that we'll be talking about. Thank you.